Hi Willy Thistlers, it's Rachel from Barkland Craft here in Fair Isle, and thank you for joining me for another postcard from Fair Isle. As you can see, I've got some of the lambs and Scampy the cat here in the background, and I'll talk about them a little bit later in this video. Thank you so much for the questions that you've been asking, and I'll crack on and work my way through those now for you. So the first question comes from Catherine, and she has asked, are there any bees on Fair Isle? And if so, are they wild or are they kept by beekeepers? And the second part of her question is, are you able to garden? Thank you for your questions, Catherine. There are bees on Fair Isle, but they're only wild bees. The main one that we get is the Shetland bee, and I'll try and put a picture of one of those here. You can't really keep bees here. I would have really liked to have done that, had a couple of hives, but unfortunately the climate is such that bees or bees that are kind of kept by people in hives just don't survive here. So. And the second part of Catherine's question, am I able to garden? Yes, I'm not a very good gardener, and I really only grow sort of a few varieties of vegetables. Our growing season is at least a month behind the rest of the UK, so there's nothing in the ground at the moment. We're on the 2nd of May today as I'm filming this. I do have some tomatoes and some salad leaves growing in pots inside, and once the weather gets a bit better, they'll come outside. As you can hopefully see, we do have blue sky today. I think we have seen the sun on 3 days since my last video episode, and as you can tell by the two jumpers, spring hasn't quite arrived because it's still really windy and cold. My next question is from Amy, and she has asked, do sheep recognise family members such as their parents, siblings or their children when they are grown? And also, do sheep have friends that they hang with in the herd? That's a great question. Yes, they do on both counts. They do recognise their family members. So Patchwork, my Suffolk Yow, who you met in the last video, and who's just there behind me, was one of my very first caddy lambs, so hand-reared lambs. She went on to have Marigold, who I still have in the flock, and Marigold went on last year to have Tiny Lamb and Big Girl. Now, Tiny Lamb is a boy, so he lives in the boys' park just over the wall, but Big Girl is, after a year kind of just living with the other year-olds, she's back in the Yows field now, and she spends quite a lot of her time with her mum, Marigold. She doesn't try to sort of suck from her, get milk from her, anything like that, but it's obvious they do still have a bond. And when Patchwork is back in the field, Marigold spends quite a bit of time around her. Also, on previous times where siblings have sort of come together, so when Ludo was in a few weeks back being treated for her foot, she could see her brother and sort of chat with her brother Lancelot through the fence. And also a couple of years ago when Blossom went back out for the first time went out into the Yows field, she and her mum, Little Miss Teddy Bear, immediately sort of recognised each other. And it's the same with people as well. Apparently, sheep can recognise human faces for up to 2 years, which is great. And they do the second part of that question, do sheep have friends or particular friends that they hang with in the herd? Absolutely, they very definitely have their own sort of friendship groups within the herd, even though they'll generally move as a big group. So if you're feeding them or moving them from one field to another, they'll work together as that big group. But they do certainly, when they're kind of just left to their own devices in the fields, you'll see them moving from one place to another, kind of in their smaller friendship groups. I have a question from Cara that quite a few people have asked is, how did Saucepan get his name? Well, I'll put some photos in to try and illustrate this as I'm talking. So Saucepan was a lamb that I found. Sorry, I've got lambs trying to eat the tripod. Saucepan was a lamb I found on the hill last year when we were doing hill rota, and I'll talk about hill rota in a minute. Hello. If you can see, oh, he's running away now, but that's Flopsy's lamb, and he's the least timid of the 5 lambs that I have. Sorry, back to Cara's question. So yeah, Saucepan I found on the hill last year. Sadly, his mum had died, and he was just by his mum, barring, and he could only have been 2 days old, if that. So he was very cold, wet, and very weak. So he came back with me in my rucksack, and was hand reared, but it took quite a while to get him used to sucking milk from a bottle, and when I'd sort of have him for feeding him, he'd try and suck on everything else. He'd suck on fingers, he'd suck on my nose, he'd try and suck on my chin, he'd try and suck on my cheek, everything apart from the bottle. So I kind of just took to calling him Sucky Lamb. And sheep are very, very quick, well, lambs are very, very quick to sort of learn their names. I know that sounds sort of silly, but if I go in the fields and I call a particular name, that sheep will sort of look up when they hear it. So they do learn their names very quickly. And I kind of thought, maybe when he's a year, 2 years, 3 years old, me going around the fields rather shouting Sucky Lamb wasn't perhaps the best name for him, but he needed something that sounded fairly similar to Sucky Lamb. So that's how he got the name Saucepan. Hello. That's this one here is one of Patchwork's lambs. He's the little boy. Question from Ruth is, how do you keep the breeds separated, or do you crossbreed your sheep? So when I first came here, I had, it was about 40 sheep that I sort of inherited with the croft, and they were a mixture of pure Shetland yows and Texel ram and a handful of Shetland Texel cross yows. So for the first few years I was here, the Texel ram would go to all of those. There wasn't any separation. Now I don't have my Texel ram anymore, I only have Shetland rams. And the yows still all live together, so I still have, well, Patchwork, the pure Suffolk, and then I still have my handful of Shetland Texel crosses. So who can we see? This one, I'll try and point to, that is Flopsy. She is half Shetland, half Texel. And I can't quite see, but the one with her bottom poking out there, that is Patience, and she is 3/4 Texel, 1/4 Shetland. So they all of them live together in the yows field, and then when it comes time for tupping, I just sort of put the crosses into a separate park, so that the ram can only go to the Shetland yows that I want them to go to. My next question is from Julie, and she says, I'd love to hear more about the shearing process. Local sheep in Pennsylvania were clipped this past month. When are the conditions right for this in Shetland? That's a really good question. So I know it seems kind of from social media that sheep around the world are clipped at, various times. Here in Shetland, again, we're kind of about a month or so behind the rest of the UK in terms of when it gets warm enough to clip and when the sheep's coats are ready to be clipped. So usually we'd start June time, at some point in June, and hopefully have them done by the end of July. I'll put a short video in of me clipping a sheep last year. That most people here on the Isle just use hand shears, although there are a few people that do use the electric clippers as well. So it's quite a slow process to clip each sheep, and as I have about 80 to do myself, it does take a good few weeks to get through them. My next question comes from Sue, and she asks a really interesting question. Is there much dung from the sheep? Do you collect it and use it, or compost it, or just leave it to fertilise the croft? That's a really interesting question. Yes, as you can imagine, there is quite a lot of dung that comes from the sheep. In the bigger fields, so in the boys' fields and in the yows' fields, that's big enough areas that we would just leave it. I wouldn't, go around collecting that at all. But you might be able to see. I'm trying to spin this round in the garden and through the gate in the other side of the garden. There are it's quite small areas, so every day or every couple of days, if I do have sheep in here during the lambing period, I do go around with an empty feed sack and pick up the poop, and then that I will store for a couple of years till it's sort of rotted down, and then that I can use on the garden. My next question is from JP Knits 1, who says, I'd love to know more about what Rachel eats. I know nothing about Scottish food, and I would think her food would also be influenced by where she lives. That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't say that we really eat kind of traditional Scottish food here. Yes, people make things like bannocks, but we're kind of limited to a point by A, what the shop gets in, and B, anything else that we can grow on our own to sort of supplement that. So the food I eat is very much just kind of food I like. It's not kind of Fair Isle specific food. I'm not sure there really is anything Fair Isle specific. It's not Scottish specific. I tend to make things in big portions that I can then sort of portion up and freeze in the freezer for sort of like ready meals, which is great at lambing, especially the last few days where Blossom, who you can't quite see her, there she is. She's now a day, coming up 2 days overdue, and because she's one of my special needs sheep, I'm currently sort of checking on her probably every half hour in the daytime, and every 2 hours through the night. So yeah, when it comes to kind of needing to eat something of an evening, I don't really have the energy to be standing in front of the cooker for great lengths of time. So it's handy just to get something out of the freezer in the morning, defrost it and shove it in the oven, so I have something ready. The next question from apologies, it's either MKRot1 or MCrot1, who says, could you take the time to show the roof styles of the house and barn? That's the first part of the question, so I'll put some photos in here. So typically the roofs of the houses here are slate tiled, and then outbuildings, byres, barns, whatever, are typically sort of corrugated metal roofing. The next part of their question is what type of hay is grown in the area. So we don't really grow hay on Fair Isle. We typically grow, well, it's called silage here, but it's not actually silage, it's what everywhere else calls haylage. So that is, we grow grass, we'll get the fertiliser put down in May, and then typically about July time that grass will all be cut. It's then turned over a couple of times to let it dry very partially, and then that's baled and wrapped to provide food for the sheep over the winter. And the next part of the question is, are they put in small square bales, large squares, or round bales? Well, here we only have one baler machine, and that's a small round bale. So I'll try and put a photo in here of what that produces. The next part of that question is what kind of grain or pellets, and I'll put a little link into one of my previous videos now where I talked about what we feed the sheep. Well, the main thing they get fed is this, which is, I think it's just called booster nuts. It's basically a barley blend with some added extras in, and then I mix in with that some of this, which is shredded beet, and that's just quite sort of tasty for them. And then some of them, if they're needing a little bit extra or they're needing encouraging to eat, this is a coarse mix. I think they call it crunch. Looks a bit like rabbit food, and that's just a really kind of tasty extra treat that will encourage them to eat, full of lots of yummy things. So that's the three main hard feeds that they get. And the final part of the question is the food produced on the island or shipped in? So there's no food apart from the silage, haylage. We can't grow any of the hard feed for sheep here on the island, so all that is shipped in from Shetland, and they in turn get it from south. And then my final question for this episode is from Anne, who says, where did you grow up and how often do you see your family? Well, I actually grew up on the east coast of England, a county called Lincolnshire, which is a very rural county. It's also known for being very flat as well, so it's quite like parts of Holland in that respect. And I grew up in a very, very small village, or it was when I lived there, called Old Leek. And I lived there until I went off to university. And then how often do I see my family? Not very often, unfortunately. My mum lives in Australia with my stepfather, and my sister lives with my brother-in-law, her husband, in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So I think the last time I saw my mum and my sister was in 2019. So yeah, it's been a while. But luckily, internet nowadays on the Isle is good enough that we can do video chatting. So I message with my sister pretty much most days, and we kind of have a video catch up every once in a while. And then my mum and I have a video chat sort of once a week, which I really look forward to. One of the jobs I've been doing recently is fencing in a new area, which will allow me to grow more grass to produce more silage bales to feed the sheep over the winter. It's hard to tell from the photos, but it's roughly 50 metres wide by about 80 metres long. Violet and Saucepan like to keep a close eye on things, and after 2 half days we were done.
finally got a really lovely day on the 19th of April, so in the evening I headed down to the beach to have a wander. It was a really low tide and quite a lot of the hill sheep were down eating the seaweed, and you can see here there's a yow teaching her two lambs which bits are the good bits of seaweed to eat. On North Haven, which is the sandy beach, I came across this dead fish. I sent the photos to a few friends on the isle and they said it's called a lump sucker fish, and apparently that sucker underneath it attaches it to rocks so it can withstand really stormy sea conditions, although I still think it looks like it's got a pair of false teeth underneath it. I then went up to the area just around Northlight and spent some time watching the puffins, which I thought you might enjoy seeing.